Barbed wire glimmered in the heat of a Texas afternoon in 1945, the sun catching every twist of the metal like the edge of a blade. Inside the compound, rows of wooden barracks stood in rigid lines, their shadows stretching long and sharp across the dust. Japanese prisoners of war, captured in the Pacific campaigns and shipped thousands of miles across ocean and desert, shuffled about in tattered uniforms. It was here, in a moment meant to be ordinary, that a small act planted itself into memory. The American guards had carried in boxes of something alien to many of these men, aluminum cans filled with beer. The POWs froze at the sight, then erupted into laughter. It was not the strained, nervous laughter of men in captivity, but the mocking laughter of cultural superiority. To drink from tin, from metal, from the same stuff that held kerosene or machine oil, it seemed absurd. One prisoner spat in the dust, sneering. A warrior's drink must be poured in porcelain, not scooped from cheap cans. He said it loud enough that his fellows nodded and chuckled. Another, who once worked as a minor functionary in Osaka, muttered that Americans were a people of factories and noise, so naturally their drink looked like something forged in an assembly line. The mockery rippled through the yard, filling the spaces where despair normally sat. What the Japanese POWs carried inside them was memory. Memory of sake. Clear and burning, poured carefully into small cups, hands steady and respectful. Sake was tied to Shinto rituals, to weddings, to military send-offs where families bowed low and whispered prayers into the steam rising from the cup. Sake was not simply drink, it was identity, tradition, the echo of 1,000 years. And now in America. These men watched their captors drink beer like water, pulling back the tin tabs with a hiss, tilting their heads, and swallowing without reverence. To the prisoners, it was proof of vulgarity, of an enemy without grace. But the laughter, though loud, hid an unspoken truth. Many of the POWs were thirsty. Rations had been leaner in Japan, sometimes reduced to millet, barley, or roots. Here, even in captivity, they were given bread, potatoes, and sometimes meat. And now beer, something they had heard of but rarely tasted. The cans clinked when stacked, a metallic chorus that reminded some of the sound of factories in Nagoya before the bombing silenced them. The guards barely looked at the prisoners' mockery. One leaned against a post, sipping slowly, watching the horizon. Another lit a cigarette, exhaling into the golden light. To them, the cans were not sacred or shameful, they were ordinary. That was the contradiction that stung the POWs most. For these men in olive drab, luxury was casual, abundance was routine. For the prisoners, everything had been precious. And so, the scene burned into memory a dusty yard, laughter laced with contempt, and the faint sparkle of tin cans in the Texas sun. None of them yet guessed that the same objects they mocked would soon erase the line between captor and captive, turning sneers into silence. And silence into something harder to name. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And as the day cooled into evening, the narrator's voice drifts to you, the viewer. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Night crept across the Texas plain, long shadows sliding over the barbed wire as the prisoners retreated into their barracks. The laughter of the afternoon still echoed faintly in their minds. To them, the image of Americans sipping beer from cans was a cultural comedy, a reminder that their captors lacked refinement. Yet as the barracks dimmed and the wooden beams creaked with the weight of silence, memory stirred, and memory was sharper than mockery. For the Japanese, alcohol had never been merely drink. It was ritual. Sake was tied to weddings, where bride and groom would sip from lacquered cups before bowing to ancestral shrines. It was tied to war, where soldiers departing for the front would be handed a final cup by their mothers or wives, each sip carrying unspoken prayers. It was tied to death, when mourners poured drops of rice wine onto the graves of the departed. The sake cup was always ceramic, sometimes ornate, sometimes plain, but always a vessel of reverence. To dishonor the drink was to dishonor the moment itself. Beer, by contrast, was a stranger to their tradition, to the Japanese prisoners. It seemed loud, clumsy, and without ceremony in their minds. Beer belonged to noisy American taverns, to baseball games, to men shouting across factory floors. It was not a drink of reflection, but of consumption. They remembered the propaganda broadcasts back home, American soldiers portrayed as drunkards, collapsing in streets, a nation of men too weak to resist temptation. The broadcasts had been designed to stir contempt, and the contempt lingered even in this far-off place. Yet the contempt was mixed with unease. For in truth, beer had existed in Japan before the war imported, expensive, a curiosity of Western influence. A few of the POWs had once tasted it in Tokyo taverns catering to foreigners. It had seemed alien then, too. One remembered sipping a frothy glass in 1938 served to him in a Western-style cafe near Ginza. The bitterness startled him. He had pretended to enjoy it, but secretly spat it out in the street. Another recalled a German advisor to the Japanese army who had insisted on beer at his farewell banquet. Even then, the Japanese officers had looked on it with suspicion, choosing sake for themselves. Inside the barracks now, men lay on their bunks and whispered. One laughed quietly, imitating the way an American tipped back the can without care. Another shook his head and muttered, "It is their culture. They are people of quantity, not quality." Yet beneath the sneers was a note of envy. Even in the middle of war, even across an ocean, the Americans seemed to have more food, more drink, more abundance. Outside, the guards continued their evening routine. A can cracked open with that sharp hiss, the sound carrying through the night air. The POWs stiffened at it. For some, it reminded them of steam escaping from rice cookers at home. For others, it was the hiss of something foreign and invasive, like a language they could not understand, and so the contrast hardened. Sake was memory, ritual, identity. Beer was noise, casualness, excess. One stood for the weight of history, the other for the churn of industry. Two, the prisoners. The difference was not simply taste, but the essence of two civilizations colliding across the barbed wire. In that silence, one thought lingered in the air, unspoken yet heavy. What would happen if the line between mockery and curiosity was ever crossed? The evening that changed everything began without warning. The prisoners had gathered inside the mess hall, a long wooden structure that smelled of dust and faint smoke from the stoves. They expected the same routine watery stew, coarse bread, and the silence of watchful guards. Yet, that night, the atmosphere carried a strange weight, like a curtain about to be pulled back. The Americans filed in, not with rifles raised, but carrying crates. At first, the POWs assumed it was food or supplies, but when the guards dropped the boxes on the table with a thud, and the unmistakable glint of aluminum showed through, the prisoners froze. Beer cans, dozens of them. No words were spoken. The sergeant in charge, a weathered man with lines carved deep into his face, pulled a single can from the top of the pile. He set it down in front of the nearest prisoner not as rations, not as punishment, but as if making an offering. The silence was unbearable. The room seemed to shrink, the scrape of boots on the wooden floor echoing like thunder. And then it came a sound so unexpected it jolted everyone, the sharp hiss of a can opening. The sergeant lifted it to his lips and drank, his Adam's apple rising and falling. He placed the can back on the table with deliberate calm and gestured faintly toward the row of POWs. For a moment, no one moved. The Japanese stared at the silver cylinders, their minds racing. Was this a trick? Was it mockery? Was it an insult dressed as generosity? Then came the gossip later recorded in diaries. One prisoner swore he saw the sergeant's hand tremble slightly before setting the can down, as though he too was uncertain of what would follow. Another claimed the guard muttered, almost under his breath, "It's just beer, nothing more." The first prisoner dared not reach. He sat stiff, eyes fixed on the can before him. Around him, his comrades whispered harshly, debating whether to touch it. One hissed, "It could be poisoned." Another sneered, "No, it is their way of humiliating us." Yet a younger man, no more than 20, muttered, "Then why drink it himself?" The sound of another can opening sliced the air. Another guard leaned against the wall, sipping casually, as though this were a summer evening back home. The hiss echoed strangely inside the wooden hall. Magnified by the tension, one POW later described it in his memoir as the sound of an enemy lowering his weapon. For long minutes, no one dared. The beer cans sat there, cold, sweating faintly under the dim light. The sergeant did not press them, did not bark an order. He simply waited. The gesture itself was louder than any words. It was a moment suspended between two worlds, humiliation and honor, suspicion and possibility. In that fragile pause, history hung balanced on the rim of a can. At last, a single hand moved. It belonged to Private First Class Masaru Nakamoto, a 23-year-old who had fought on Saipan before his capture. His face was gaunt, his lips dry, and though his pride told him to resist, thirst and curiosity tugged harder. Slowly, he reached for the can, his fingertips brushing the cold aluminum. The room seemed to hold its breath. He tilted it to his lips. The first sip was hesitant, his throat working in small gulps. His expression shifted from defiance to surprise. The liquid was not foul, not tasteless as he had imagined. It was crisp, cold, and laced with a sharp bitterness that cut through his parched throat. He paused, stared at the can, then whispered hoarsely, "It is not sake, but it is something." The words broke the tension. Another POW reached, then another. Soon the sound of tabs snapping open filled the room, one after another like a strange kind of music, with each hiss. The suspicion softened. Men lifted their cans, sipping cautiously, some grimacing at the bitterness, others raising their brows at the unexpected refreshment. For men raised on sake. The contrast was startling. Sake was warm, smooth, its heat blooming slowly in the chest. Beer struck differently. It was cold at first contact, alive with bubbles, and its bitterness lingered like a challenge. Yet beneath it came a strange ease, a cooling relief in the desert heat of Texas. Something even ritual could not provide. Whispers followed. One man confessed quietly that he had once worked at a brewery in Kobe before the war, where foreign beer was sometimes bottled for wealthy clients. He admitted he had never tasted it then, only smelled its yeasty aroma through wooden walls. Another laughed at his own reaction, saying the bitterness made him wince like a child, for the first time since captivity. Their voices carried not only mockery, but genuine surprise. A small but striking detail emerged that night in his diary. Corporal Takeshi Morita later wrote that he felt ashamed of how quickly he drank, as though the beer had awakened a hunger he did not know he carried. "We thought it vulgar," he wrote, "yet I drained it faster than I should. The cold ran through me like a river." The guards watched silently at first, then exchanged glances. Some smirked, others shrugged. For them, this was nothing just cans of ordinary lager, distributed to ease a long shift. But to the prisoners, it was a revelation. The bitterness, the coolness, the very ordinariness of the drink carried weight. It was proof that their captors lived in a world of plenty, a world where even prisoners could taste what had once been unimaginable. The hall, once filled with tension, grew softer, not friendly, not yet. But the line of derision had been crossed. In the clinking of cans and the muted gasps of surprise, a bridge was beginning to form. And as the night deepened, one question pulsed silently among them if even beer could surprise them. What else about the enemy might prove different than they had been told? The first cans were emptied quickly, some drained in gulps, others sipped slowly with lingering suspicion. As the metallic clinks echoed across the mess hall, something intangible began to shift. The guards, once silhouettes of authority, now looked less like captors and more like men unwinding after a long day. One leaned back, balancing his chair against the wall, and let out a low chuckle as if he had forgotten for a moment that the room was filled with prisoners. For the POWs, the beer worked its quiet alchemy. The bitterness mellowed into warmth, spreading through their chests, loosening their tongues. Men who had entered the hall with rigid backs and clenched jaws now sat easier, their eyes softer, their voices no longer confined to whispers. Nervous laughter emerged first, thin and awkward, like a child learning to speak again. Then it grew louder, punctuated by the occasional slap of a palm on the table. One American private surprised everyone by walking to the corner, propping his rifle against the wall, and sitting down among the prisoners. He cracked open another can, took a sip, then nodded at the man beside him, a former schoolteacher from Nagasaki. No words were exchanged at first, just the shared rhythm of swallowing, the shared escape from silence. The gossip of the camp later recalled this moment vividly. A POW from Fukuoka whispered afterward that he saw the guard's hand shake slightly as he sat down, as though he too felt the strangeness of what was happening. Another claimed he heard one prisoner mutter, "He is foolish, but brave." As the evening went on, barriers thinned. The guards spoke of ordinary things, a baseball game back home, the taste of cornbread from their mother's kitchens, the endless dust of Texas that clung to everything. The prisoners responded with fragments of their own lives. One mentioned a fishing village where the tide determined the rhythm of every day. Another spoke of cherry blossoms in spring, falling on temple roofs like snow. In that room, the categories of captor and captive blurred for the first time. Human voices replaced the sound of boots and commands. Even laughter dared to rise, a POW later wrote in his confiscated diary. "I laughed with the enemy that night, and the sound startled me more than the war itself. But beyond the warmth of beer and the flicker of humor, an undercurrent of tension still pulsed. Was this a momentary reprieve, or something more dangerous, the recognition of shared humanity?" The prisoners did not know, and neither did the guards. What they did know was that the air in the mess hall felt different, as if the walls had shifted slightly, making more space for breath. And so, for the first time since capture, the night closed not with silence or bitterness, but with the faint echo of men chuckling together. And to you, watching now, tell me this, would you have accepted that first sip, or would you have let it sit untouched? A symbol of pride held too tightly. By the time the third round of cans was opened, the sound had become familiar, no longer strange or suspicious, but almost welcome. The sharp hiss of pressurized aluminum gave way to conversation, and conversation gave way to stories. Words that had been locked tight behind clenched jaws spilled out into the night. One prisoner, a fisherman from Hokkaido, spoke haltingly about his village battered by storms, of mornings when the sea gave nothing and his family went hungry. An American guard nodded slowly, then shared how his own father's farm in Kansas had been ruined by drought years before the war. The two men, separated by language but linked by memory, lifted their cans in silent acknowledgement. Others joined. A former Japanese student from Kyoto described the cherry blossoms that lined the Kamo River, his voice softening as he remembered lanterns flickering during spring festivals. In response, a guard recalled the sound of summer cicadas in Oklahoma, his tone carrying the same bittersweet ache. A POW who had worked as a carpenter spoke of his daughter's wooden toys, left behind in the ashes of Osaka. Across the table, another guard, no older than 20, muttered that he too had a child just learning to walk. The gossip of that night lingered in the camp for weeks. Some swore they saw an American wipe his eyes after hearing of the carpenter's daughter. Others whispered that a Japanese officer, who had once barked at subordinates with iron pride, lowered his gaze when the guard mentioned his infant son. For a few hours, the divide of uniforms seemed paper thin. And then came the numbers, the scale that widened the gulf between what the prisoners knew and what they now witnessed. Someone mentioned, almost casually, that America had produced over 80 million barrels of beer in 1944 alone, despite being at war on two fronts. The prisoners stared. 80 million. The number hung in the air like thunder. One POW muttered that Japan could barely brew enough sake for ceremonies, let alone drown a continent in alcohol. Another, shaking his head, said softly, "This is the power of a nation with endless factories." This statistic was more than a number. It was a revelation. Beer, to them, was no longer just drink. It was proof of abundance, of industry, of an enemy who could supply comfort, even in the shadow of global war. It was both humiliating and awe-inspiring. Yet for all the numbers, it was the human details that carved deepest. A laugh shared over a bitter sip, a sigh when the past surfaced, a pause when silence carried more than words. And now, I'll ask you, the one watching this story unfold, when you've traveled or lived far from home, what food or drink shocked you most? What taste shattered your expectations and made you realize the world was wider than you thought? Share it below your story. Like theirs, is part of this tapestry of memory. When the last cans were emptied, silence returned to the barracks, but it was not the silence of fear or hostility. It was quieter, softer, the hush that comes after laughter, when men are too tired to speak but too moved to sleep. The silver cylinders, now crushed or stacked in neat rows, gleamed under the faint light of a lantern. Their presence was absurd and profound. At the same time, objects once mocked as vulgar now stood as silent proof of something unexpected. In the days that followed, whispers spread. Some POWs dismissed the evening as a passing anomaly, a trick of circumstance. Others, though, carried it like a secret flame. One diary entry, later confiscated by censors, read the night of beer. I felt less like a prisoner. I remembered my home. I remembered that even an enemy can laugh. Another, written by a former naval officer, confessed. I feared I would forget who I was. Instead, I discovered who I still am. The guards spoke less openly, but gossip traveled between them too. Some admitted that sitting with prisoners felt like breaking a rule, even if no order had been given. One told another that it reminded him of sharing drinks after a baseball game back home, except here, his teammates had once been his foes. The strangeness lingered, yet so did the memory for the POWs. The night became a reference point, days of labor, of heat and monotony, blurred together, but the beer night stood apart, retold in hushed tones during roll call or whispered as men lay on their bunks. A fisherman would remind his friend of the taste, a carpenter would mimic the pop of a can opening, and laughter would ripple briefly before dying back down. Years later, after the war had ended and the prisoners had returned home, some recounted that night as one of the most hauntingly human moments of captivity. An old man in Yokohama told his grandson that night, "Beneath the moon, we drank with the enemy, and for a few hours, the war disappeared. The boy, too young to understand, only remembered the way his grandfather's eyes shimmered with both sorrow and wonder." The symbolic image remained etched in their memories, the row of empty cans catching the moonlight through the barracks' small window. Cold metal reflecting silver light. A reminder that humanity can flicker even in captivity. It was not reconciliation in treaties or headlines, but something quieter. More intimate men stripped of pride long enough to share a drink, and in that act, to remember they were human. The war continued, battles raged, and cities burned. But for those who were there, the beer night lived on as a crack in the armor of hatred, a reminder that even enemies could sit at the same table, if only for the span of a drink. History often remembers the loudest moments, the roar of artillery, the thunder of bombers, the cries of victory and defeat. Yet buried within the vast machinery of war are quieter fragments, fragile and easily forgotten. Moments when humanity insisted on surfacing, even in the most unlikely places. The night when Japanese prisoners of war drank American beer in a Texas camp was one such fragment. It did not change the outcome of battles. It did not erase the bitterness of surrender or undo the devastation that consumed cities across the Pacific. But for those who lived it, that single evening carried a weight far beyond its surface. What began as mockery laughter at a tin can, scorn for a foreign habit became a window into another world. Each sip dissolved suspicion. Each shared story thinned the wire that divided them. One old soldier, decades later, confessed that he still dreamed of the sound, the faint hiss of cans opening in the dim hall, a sound that reminded him not of war, but of possibility. Another admitted that the taste of beer, bitter and cold, lingered longer in his memory than the taste of rations or the sting of defeat. For them, the beer night became not about alcohol, but about recognition. Recognition that enemies, too, carried homes in their hearts. Recognition that even within cages of barbed wire, the smallest gesture could restore dignity. Perhaps that is why the image endures empty cans stacked in rows, catching moonlight like silver lanterns. They shine not as symbols of triumph, nor as relics of humiliation, but as quiet testimony that in the darkest seasons of history, humanity does not vanish, it flickers, fragile yet enduring, like the glow of a lantern against the night.